Death by King John of England, the forgotten atrocity at Corfe Castle. One of the most chilling and largely forgotten atrocities committed during the reign of King John of England was the deliberate starvation of 22 knights at Corfe Castle. This act of cruelty, orchestrated by the king himself, remains a dark chapter in medieval English history, yet it has received surprisingly little attention from modern historians. Corfe Castle, located in Dorset, now stands as a majestic ruin. But during the early 13th century, it was one of the grandest royal residences in England and a favored retreat of King John. He spent more time at Corfe than at nearly any other royal stronghold, apart from Marlborough, and poured significant resources into transforming it. Lavish royal apartments, grand chambers, and enhanced fortifications turned the castle into both a palace and a prison, and it was within these very walls that a chilling episode unfolded. In what is now recognized as one of the most brutal episodes of his reign, King John ordered 22 knights to be starved to death at Corfe. The reason? They had been implicated in opposing the crown, either directly or by association, during a time of political instability and dynastic tension. Despite the shocking nature of this mass execution, the death by King John of England at Corfe Castle has remained a footnote in many historical narratives. It is often mentioned only briefly, if at all, overshadowed by other notorious events such as the starvation of Magna de Braose and her son, the wife and child of William de Braose, one of John's former allies turned enemy, and the suspicious death of John's own nephew, Arthur of Brittany. The context for these brutal acts lies in the dynastic conflict that erupted after the death of King Richard the Lionheart in 1199. Although John assumed the English crown with minimal resistance, other parts of the Angevin Empire, especially Brittany and Anjou, supported the claim of Arthur of Brittany, the teenage son of Geoffrey, John's elder brother who had died in 1186. Initially, John secured his position, but hostilities resumed by 1202, reigniting the War of Succession. It was during this turbulent period that the Corfe Castle incident occurred, a stark reflection of John's ruthlessness in consolidating power and eliminating perceived threats. The death by King John of England at Corfe remains a haunting reminder of how far a monarch could go to maintain control in a fragmented and volatile medieval world. These actions contributed to the king's notorious reputation and helped fuel the growing discontent that would culminate in the Magna Carta rebellion of 1215. Death by King John of England, the capture of Arthur of Brittany and the seeds of tyranny. On July 30, 1202, King John of England received a message that would alter the course of his reign. His mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, was under siege by Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew and rival claimant to the throne, at the castle of Mirbeau, just 15 miles north of Poitiers. Eleanor's capture would have been a catastrophic political blow, threatening to shift the balance of power in the ongoing succession crisis that had gripped the Angevin Empire. Though nearly 100 miles away in Le Mans, John acted with astonishing speed. In a rare moment of military brilliance, he and his forces marched through the night. At dawn on August 1, 1202, they launched a surprise assault on the besieging forces at Mirbeau. The result was total victory. Arthur of Brittany, along with his leading supporters, was captured. John was elated. His triumph was so complete that he sent a celebratory letter to his regents in England, declaring, "God be praised for our happy success." However, this early triumph would soon unravel, and would ultimately contribute to the grim reputation that surrounds the death by King John of England. The turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of the victory. Rather than treating his captives with the expected chivalric decency, John subjected them to extraordinary cruelty. The knights captured at Mirbeau were paraded in carts, chained and shackled, and transported across Normandy. According to the history of William Marshall, they were held in such appalling conditions that even John's own followers were shocked, describing it as a disgrace and humiliation. While some prisoners, including Arthur, remained in Normandy, John had so many detainees that dozens were shipped to English castles for confinement. Yet it was not the act of capture, but John's harsh refusal to negotiate with Arthur's supporters, that would prolong the rebellion. The refusal alienated many of John's allies and emboldened his enemies. By October 1202, rebel forces had recaptured key cities, including Angers and Tours. With his grip weakening, John was forced to retreat to Normandy. In his desperation, John reportedly gave orders for Arthur to be mutilated, orders that were not carried out. Then, in January 1203, the king visited Arthur's prison at the castle of Falaise. According to chronicler Roger of Wendover, John offered his nephew titles and honors in exchange for peace. Arthur, however, remained defiant, declaring he would not end his resistance until John surrendered the entire Angevin Empire, including England. Though Wendover's account has elements of legend, it is partially substantiated. Official records confirm John visited Falaise on January 30, 1203, staying for several days. What happened during that meeting is still debated, but shortly afterward, Arthur of Brittany vanished. His mysterious disappearance would become one of medieval England's greatest unsolved crimes. The chroniclers widely believed he was murdered on John's orders, possibly by drowning or stabbing, in the early months of 1203. Though never proven, this alleged death by King John of England would cast a long shadow over the king's legacy and ignite a wave of outrage that led to open rebellion, culminating in the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215. Death by King John of England. The mass starvation at Corfe Castle. The later stages of King John's vengeance reveal the terrifying depths of his cruelty, most notably in the orchestrated mass starvation of his prisoners at Corfe Castle. This act was not a sudden impulse, but a calculated decision, carried out with chilling precision and secrecy. On January 30, 1203, the same day John visited his imprisoned nephew Arthur at Falaise, he dispatched orders to one of his most trusted enforcers, Hugh de Neville. The command was explicit: cross the Channel to England and deliver 2 prisoners from the Mirbeau campaign, Warren de Craon and Maurice de Bajuin, to the fortress at Corfe. If this had been the extent of the plan, it would already have marked a disturbing escalation. But within just 5 days, the operation expanded significantly. John issued a flurry of writs addressed to the wardens of 18 different castles across England. These letters overrode all prior instructions concerning the custody of their inmates. In total, 22 named individuals, all knights captured at Mirbeau, were ordered to be transferred to Corfe Castle. Shortly thereafter, the king sent a letter to the Constable of Corfe, instructing him to follow the verbal directives of Thomas, a royal clerk, and Hugh de Neville. These verbal instructions were never recorded in writing, a telling omission. But their content is made horrifyingly clear by multiple contemporary chroniclers. According to the annalist at Margam Abbey in Wales, 22 of the noblest and strongest in arms were starved to death in Corfe Castle, so that not one of them escaped. This mass killing, carried out through deliberate starvation, is one of the most extreme breaches of medieval norms. It is essential to understand just how politically taboo such a decision was in the context of the time. Since the mid-11th century, it had become increasingly unacceptable in Western Europe for nobles to execute one another. Between 1076, when William the Conqueror executed the Earl of Northumbria, and 1306, when Edward I hanged the Earl of Athol, deliberate state-sanctioned killings of top-ranking aristocrats were virtually unheard of. By choosing to starve over 20 noble prisoners to death, King John shattered this centuries-old convention. The death by King John of England at Corfe Castle was not only a personal act of revenge, it was a shocking political statement. It signaled that John was willing to abandon the foundational codes of chivalric restraint that held medieval aristocracy together. For modern audiences, dulled by fantasy depictions of medieval brutality, such as those in Game of Thrones, this might seem less shocking than it truly was. But in its time, the atrocity at Corfe was a scandal, a public and symbolic breaking of the unspoken rules of noble warfare and aristocratic conduct. The massacre would further tarnish King John's already crumbling reputation, fueling rebellion across his territories and contributing to the tidal wave of baronial opposition that would, within little more than a decade, force the crown to the negotiating table at Runnymede. Death by King John of England. Starvation as political terror. The horror of King John's actions at Corfe Castle lies not only in the fact that he orchestrated the deaths of over 20 knights, but in the calculated, torturous method he chose to carry it out. Starvation, even in the brutal world of medieval politics, was an exceptionally rare and despised form of execution. Unlike battlefield deaths or swift executions, death by starvation was slow, degrading, and psychologically harrowing. Few rulers in the Middle Ages resorted to it. One chronicler notes that Richard I, John's own brother, ordered the starvation of a man who had tried to obstruct his release from German captivity. 2 centuries later, King Richard II was rumored to have died of starvation. Whether self-inflicted or imposed by others remains unclear. But King John of England stands apart for having used starvation repeatedly as a tool of statecraft and repression. After his experiment at Corfe in 1203, he began to deploy starvation with disturbing frequency. In 1210, he infamously ordered the imprisonment of Matilda de Braose and her son William, both of whom perished from starvation, either at Corfe or Windsor. Chroniclers describe them as having wasted away in darkness and neglect. 2 years later, in 1212, Geoffrey, the Archdeacon of Norwich, was also reported to have died in a royal prison after a prolonged and punishing confinement, possibly another victim of the king's preferred method of slow death. The pattern continued. In October 1215, during the height of the Civil War, the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall recorded that King John threatened to starve the captured rebel baron Oliver de Argenton, only halting the process after 3 days when Oliver's brother agreed to surrender. And in early 1216, the rebel garrison at Belvoir Castle reportedly gave in after John threatened to starve their lord, William Dewing. The case of Oliver de Argenton is particularly revealing, providing a potential window into the king's strategic mindset. Coggeshall's account suggests John used starvation not only as punishment, but as psychological warfare, a way to coerce others into submission through the suffering of their kin. This raises the question, was the death by King John of England at Corfe Castle truly just an act of revenge, or was it also a cruel bargaining tactic? If John's goal had been simple extermination, he could have left the knights scattered across English castles and ordered their starvation locally. But instead, he gathered them all at Corfe, one of the few castles on England's south coast facing Normandy, close enough to allow for quick communication with his domains across the Channel. This choice appears intentional. Corfe was not just a prison, it was a stage. It's plausible that John hoped word of the knights' suffering would reach Arthur and his supporters in Anjou and Brittany. In the same way he later pressured Oliver de Argenton's brother into surrender, John may have intended to force Arthur into renouncing his claim to the Angevin Empire, or to break the resistance of their noble families still in arms. Whether as an act of personal cruelty or calculated political terror, the starvation at Corfe remains one of the most chilling examples of psychological manipulation in royal history. The death by King John of England was not merely a historical footnote, it was a clear violation of medieval codes of honor and a foreshadowing of the tyrannical behavior that would eventually lead to his downfall. Death by King John of England. Cruelty or strategy? While some historians have speculated that King John's actions at Corfe Castle may have served a political purpose, using starvation as psychological leverage, an alternative, and perhaps more disturbing, explanation persists, that John was simply driven by cruelty. The charge of sadism was not a retrospective judgment but a view widely held by his contemporaries. Chroniclers writing during and shortly after his reign consistently described him as a man of extreme and gratuitous violence. The history of William Marshall, written by a loyal knight of the time, accused him of treating his prisoners with disgraceful inhumanity. Ralph of Coggeshall, another contemporary observer, recorded multiple instances of John's cold and vindictive nature. Even those aligned with John expressed disgust. The Anonymous of Bethune, writing in service of a Flemish lord who had fought for the king during the Civil War of 1215 to 1216, bluntly called him a very bad man, more cruel than all others. And perhaps most damning of all, William Marshall's biographer, no enemy of the crown, labeled John not just a tyrant, but a felon, a medieval term denoting a criminal or villain. The repeated use of starvation, a method rare even in the brutal context of the Middle Ages, stands as a testament to his reputation. Whether it was the mass execution of knights at Corfe Castle, the slow deaths of the de Braose family, or the threatened torment of Oliver de Argenton, John's reign was marked by a pattern of cruelty that alienated allies and terrified enemies alike. In the end, The death by King John of England was not merely a political misstep or a miscalculated act of power, it was the culmination of a reign defined by fear, repression, and a disregard for the moral limits even tyrants of the era typically observed. This legacy of brutality would outlive him, seared into historical memory and contributing to the rebellion that forced him to seal the Magna Carta, the very document that would become the foundation for constitutional governance in the centuries that followed. If you found this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters of English royal history compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. For more historical investigations into power, politics, and the figures who shaped our world, join us every week here on History Love. What do you think? Was King John a calculated strategist or a cruel tyrant? Tell us in the comments below.